Yeah, so just to give myself a bit of an intro to start before we jump into the presentation, can you all hear me okay as well? I have a notoriously very quiet voice. My name is Tarren. I am a data scientist. I currently work at Invenergy, which is a renewable energy company based here in Chicago. I graduated from an MSCAPP program as well in 2022. So I was here from 2020 to 2022. And now have about 4 years working as a professional data scientist between the public sector and the energy sector for the most part. Briefly worked at the Census Bureau after graduating from the master's program. And then most of my professional experience has been at an organization called Rewiring America, but we'll get into all of that as we go. I probably could have just gone ahead and shown this. Oh, it's so much smaller on this. Okay. It was looking way bigger on my computer screen when I was making it. But anyway, these are the points we're going to cover today. Just going to walk through each of these different steps in my career path so far. So yeah, we'll start with undergraduate. As I was saying before, studied at Georgetown University. As an undergrad, I studied in the School of Foreign Service there, which is a part of the school that's focused originally on training diplomats. So most of the course curriculum is focused around economics, political science, and foreign languages. And I spent most of my time as an undergrad studying development economics, specifically in the Middle East, because I was also an Arabic minor while I was there. So yeah, that was my focus. I mostly put this slide up here to just show that what you majored in undergrad doesn't have to determine your career, because I was very determined for a long time that I was going to be a diplomat or going to work in the development industry. My career has obviously taken a different path, but it's still quite interesting. So yeah. So just, I guess I also wanted to sort of say at the top, what I'm trying to hopefully go through in this presentation is I want to dive into some of my experiences and talk about particular projects that I worked on at all these different places to show how computer science and data science can have applications in the sort of environmental or energy spaces. Because that, to me, when I was a master's student, was kind of unclear, and I was really hoping to move into this industry. So trying to just elucidate some different pathways that you can potentially take. And then also, as we go through, I'm just going to highlight things that I draw from each of these experiences and put on my resume, because that was also something I often struggle with, is how to talk about these technical projects or what things to highlight. So that's going to be my focus as I'm going through. Cool. So yeah, so just then talking about what, if anything, I really talk about from undergrad still on my resume. The short answer is not a lot. I don't include basically anything anymore from my undergrad. It's been too long ago, as we can see from those dates. I do talk about extracurricular involvement with one student club that has a really developed alumni network. And then I also talk about language skills, because Arabic was really hard to learn, and I want to have some credit for that somewhere. Cool. All right, so after I graduated, I worked a couple of different jobs for the first few years out of school. First as a consultant at the State Department, and then at an e-commerce startup. I'm not going to go into any depth about these because they were really boring, and I don't want to talk about them anymore. And yeah, I don't talk about these at all on my resume, because first jobs don't define your career, and you can, take a lot of different pathways. Cool. Okay. So now moving on. This is the first one I'll actually give some serious time to. So in 2019, I moved to Myanmar as part of the Princeton in Asia Fellowship Program. To start working as a data analyst at an agricultural NGO there. And yeah, I was working at this place called Proximity Designs, which, as I was saying, was an agricultural NGO. It was mostly focused on trying to help smallholder farmers improve their incomes. And that was through 2 primary channels. One was selling these irrigation products, one of which you can see in this photo here. The other of which was agronomy advice. So giving advice about what time of year to plant certain crops, or how to identify certain pest infestations and things like that. And I was part of a pretty small and new data team that was recently formed with the organization, and we worked on a variety of projects. Some of them, things like predicting crop price, which are maybe more classic ML stuff, but then also just general kind of data record management with things like managing their customer records and finding a good way to do that in a place where not everybody had consistent phone numbers or ID cards or things like that. and working on a very rudimentary chatbot, which would be embarrassing to talk about now, given the sort of progress that chatbots have made since then. But yeah, so the things I like to highlight on this from this section on my resume these days, like this was before I went to grad school, so all of the data stuff I was doing here was pretty like naive in comparison to the things I learned how to do in grad school and have gained experience in since then. So I don't really like dwell a lot on most of the things I was doing there because those are not necessarily the skill sets that I'm wanting to highlight these days. But there's sort of two primary things that I like to highlight there. One was this like project where we were trying to model crop prices in some of these just like smaller villages and stuff that we were working in. And those places had limited access to traditional data sets. So I think it's nice to just talk about modeling in circumstances that are a bit harder. Like I don't know that I fully stand by all the methodology we did, but still just a nice thing to talk about that you've like thought about these sorts of problems before and wrangled with them. And I think more importantly, the way that this most often comes up is this experience was what motivated me to start moving in towards climate work. So I had talked before, like attending the SFS, I was mostly interested in becoming a diplomat or continuing to work on international development policy. But when I was living in Myanmar, I saw for the first time that like climate change was a real problem that was affecting the lives of people, especially these like populations that I had been really interested in trying to like work with in the past. So I read at the time a book called The Uninhabitable Earth. I'm not sure if anybody here has read it, but it's a book about the effects of climate change, and it has a really particular emphasis on the unequal distribution of those effects and how the places in the world that are going to warm the most quickly, or I guess the quickest, are places that are already experiencing a lot of other sort of like covariate problems. So, you know, these impacts are not going to be felt equally. And I was seeing that firsthand as we were working with farmers, people who are like already very exposed to the climate just on a good day. But as like monsoon patterns were changing in Myanmar, it's very slowly happening, but expected to get worse in the future. Like farmers were already really left out dry in some cases when they were like trying to plant rice for the season. So this is like the way that this most often comes up for me, just as like my sort of gateway into being interested in this movement and trying to work towards reducing carbon emissions. Cool. Okay, so graduate school. We'll like start slowing down a little bit here as we talk about the stuff that's a little bit more relevant for y'all. So as I was saying, I was in the computational analysis for public policy program at CAP. I don't think I need to give too much detail. I think most of you are familiar with it, it seems. I spent most of my time in CAP mostly focused on technical coursework. I felt that I had a pretty solid basis in sort of policy background given my undergrad and some of my previous work education, or my work experience, excuse me. So I was interested in gaining technical skills and particularly data science skills. I did take a few energy and environmental sort of policy electives, and I'm happy to talk about those further, but that was definitely not my focus in my time at CAP. And yeah, so the two things that I talk about most often from CAP on my resume, again, sorry to disappoint for the grad students in here, I don't actually talk that much on my resume about grad school itself. I gained a lot of skills there and it really influenced my career, but I try to keep things focused on my experiences so far. But one thing I do talk about quite frequently is I TA'd for some CAP courses, in particular CAP, was it 121? Yeah, 121 and 122. And so those experiences really taught me a lot about technical communication and how to like teach technical concepts to people who are coming in the door maybe with like varying levels of technical understanding and like how to build that understanding from week to week. So I talk about that experience quite often, either on my resume or in interviews. And yeah, the other thing, I'll occasionally throw relevant coursework based off of classes I took into my resume as well, especially if I don't have like professional experience that matches whatever sort of skill set a job is looking for, but I took a class on it in the past. I'll try and include that coursework so that I have something to talk about if it ever comes up in an interview. Yeah, okay. Also, feel free to interrupt with questions throughout. Now we're getting into the parts that are like a little bit meatier for y'all. Cool, okay. So one thing I did do while I was here at the university was to work at the Energy Policy Institute, EPIC, which is still around, right? It's not, okay.
Institute for
Cool.
Climate and Sustainable Growth.
Perfect, yes. So I was a Bartlett Fellow, is that the right term? Yes, okay, my second year at CAP. And when I was a fellow, I was working for Amir Jina. I'm not sure if any of y'all have taken classes with him yet, but he is faculty at Harris and is focused on climate and energy policy and some international development stuff as well. But yeah, the project that we were working on together, we were working on this sort of like larger interdisciplinary team that was working to classify floating patches of plastic, I always have a hard time saying that, that are in the ocean based off of data that's available from the European Space Agency. So this is data that's made freely available to researchers. And we were trying to particularly understand how that plastic can accumulate over time at like the mouth of rivers and things like that to show, like, I think our hope was to link it upstream to like human activity, but like for it to serve as a data set for other researchers to use to do studies of their own to show how plastic might accumulate based off of human activity. And at this point, I also wanted to give some stuff for the technical audience in the that's here because I figured some more technical folks would come out tonight. And I'm gonna go into some depth about how these projects worked and like what the sort of models and things like that were under the hood. Cool, okay. I was really blitzing through these slides like in the hour before I came here, and this is a really shitty architecture diagram from ChatGPT. Okay, but sort of to walk through the process, like when we were working, we would, when I joined the team at least, the model was already trained, which I'm happy to talk about that a little bit further, but we would download grid images like this from the European Space Agency. And so they would be images like this that would partially contain land and then would show the coastline as it's starting to get deeper out into the like open water. In reality, I'm not sure if any of you have worked with this sort of satellite data in the past, but the satellite data is actually composed of a lot of different layers. So it's in reality not a single flat file or like a flat shape, but a matrix of a lot of different layers. And each of those layers represents different data. So some of that is like the data that we use to show normal images, like the red, green, blue spectrum. But we also have like the infrared spectrum and other sort of spectrums of light that can be useful, that have useful data as well. And so basically we would take this, we would split apart into these different parts of the matrix, parts of the different visible light spectrum. We would take certain of those wavelengths and then do some vector operations on them, which I'm also happy to talk about further. And those vectors were then concatenated together and fed into a tree-based model. So not a deep learning model, we were not that sophisticated at the time, but then that output of that model was to classify different things that were floating in the water or just classify different pixels as water themselves. So here's a sort of brief representation of kind of like what that would look like. We would be able to highlight certain pixels like this yellow here as plastic in the ocean. And these would also be like much more colorful because we'd be identifying the water, we would be identifying sea foam was another thing that was often floating at the surface, or like wood and algae, like sort of organic matter that was at the surface as well. But yeah, this is the sort of basic pipeline. And my role, at least as a research assistant at the time, was to take this pipeline and scale it on the research computing cluster here at the university. So in particular, I was talking about some of these vector operations that were happening, and that was the real like bottleneck in our ability to scale this up to classify both over time and over space. So when I joined, the sort of project was at this scale of like just predicting for a single kind of patch of ocean, and they figured out the model to do that. And my job was to help scale it up so that they could predict either for the same location over time or for multiple locations. And yeah, the way I ended up doing that was like, I think an experience you might have as you start to work more professionally in coding is that you'll often, I think even more so these days with vibe coding, like you'll come into a code base where people have put something together, but like don't exactly understand how everything fits together and are not necessarily following best computer science practices either. And so a lot of this was just sort of like basic sort of wrapping into functions and things like that I could then use really helpful Python packages like Numba and JIT in particular to sort of put this into more basic and faster C code, and then parallelization packages as well. I think I was using Dask in this particular use case. But yeah, then farming that job out over the research computing cluster so that we could, we could classify a lot more patches of ocean over time. I'm not really sure what happened with this project after I left. I'm not sure. I don't think it ever got published. I never heard anything else about it. So I'm guessing something happened after I left, but we at least got it to scale and to run faster. And so that was really fun. And so from things like, I guess also when I'm talking about these, like anytime I'm going in depth in a project like this, I'm talking about this a lot on my resume usually. There's like multiple points that I'm extracting from that project, either different packages I was using, different sort of concepts I was using. So here I'll talk a lot about parallelization. I'll talk a lot about using a research computing cluster, those sorts of things. But other things that I was trying to highlight here in my resume and in interview questions and things like that. One is like working with an interdisciplinary team. So I think many computer scientists in particular, but also data scientists, have a pretty bad reputation of like, oh no.
Did the mouse just go quiet?
I don't know.
This would happen during the computer
I know.
science related.
Oh, here we go. Okay. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So interdisciplinary. I think computer scientists in particular, but also data scientists, have a bad reputation of having really specific expertise that they're bad at talking to people who are not trained as computer scientists or data scientists. And so one thing I try to highlight here is that like I was the only computer scientist working on this project. Everybody else was like an economist or an oceanographer or all these other sorts of disciplines. So all much, much smarter than me, but had much more specific domain expertise in other areas. And so being able to sort of like communicate across that group so that we could work on this project together is something I always try to highlight. Another thing is just about scaling an existing code base. So another thing you'll often have when you get into your professional career is that you're walking into a code base where somebody else has written the majority of that code. And it's your job to then go in and do some task. You have to be able to understand what's going on in the code base, like find the specific place where you need to make an intervention, and then make sure that you don't break it like after you make that intervention. And so this was my first time really doing that, but probably still the most significant code base I've walked into that I had no hand in creating. And so I still do talk about that sort of part of the experience quite often as well. Where's my mouse? Okay, cool, I just can click. Cool, okay, so yeah, I worked on that from 21 to 22, which was up to the point when I graduated from CAP. And in the summer after I graduated CAP, I started working at the Census Bureau as a data science contractor. So I was not a full-time employee there, but was working as a contractor. And yeah, the sort of to give some context on the project I was working on here, people are most familiar with the census because it collects demographic information about the US, but it runs a variety of surveys. And the one that I was working for in particular was called the economic census, and their job is to survey businesses for information that is like relevant to them. And so some of those sort of points that they collect are like how many people that business employs, how much like revenue they collect in a given year, and then also like what type of business it is. But a lot of that data is collected by other federal agencies. So Bureau of Labor Statistics collects how much employment there is. The IRS will know how much revenue they make. But there's like one field in particular, that industrial classification that I was talking about, that is unique to the census to collect. And so they were always trying to find ways that they could not have to send out surveys to collect that information, since it was really the only sort of like point of value that they were picking up. And so I was working on a project there that was trying to take businesses and classify them into these industrial classification codes, which are called NAICS codes, if anybody has ever used them before in their work. But they're these like very specific, I'll actually break it down in a second. But we were trying to use information that businesses published about themselves online to classify them into those NAICS codes. So instead of having to send out a survey, we could just hopefully find information from their website or from Google and use that to train a model or predict for this particular business. And so, yeah, this still makes sense. This is a basic sort of diagram of the architecture that we put together. So is my mouse going to show up? No, okay. So I actually started at the end with the classification code that we were predicting. I was saying that it was like a very specific sort of classification code, and we were trying to predict those codes at the 6-digit level. And so we can see, I just made one up there. I can't remember the codes anymore off the top of my head, but as you're sort of descending down the hierarchy of that code, it adds additional information. So for instance, if we were to predict only at the 4-digit level here, that might be things like food service businesses. And then if you were to predict at the 5-digit, it's starting to be like, actually maybe the like 4 digits would be like just commercial businesses that like sell to customers. And then at a 5-digit, it would be restaurants. And then at a 6-digit, it's like the specific type of restaurant it is. And so the data we ended up collecting to do this sort of prediction, we mostly got from Google. So we would take the name of a business that was self-reported and ping Google's API to get the description of that business off of Google Maps, any reviews that were there on Google Maps, and then if a website was also linked on that particular business, we would go to the website and scrape the homepage and then use that text as well. And so basically we would, oh, finally got my mouse. We would take that text, and each of those texts we would run through a Hugging Face sort of pre-trained encoder to get out a vector or a numeric vector, an embedding of that text. And so we would basically then take each of those text embeddings, we would concatenate them together, and then also use a tree-based model to predict this 6-digit NAICS code. This model architecture worked pretty well. Like I ended up not, like I saw it through the first phase and then my contract ended. And it ended up getting about like a 60% accuracy, which was not great, but it was at like a 30% accuracy when I walked in. So I was happy with the improvement. But the reason I started talking some about the structure of that NAICS code before is that I think we were starting to run into issues when we were only trying to predict at the 6-digit off the jump, because there's an information hierarchy there, we could probably have a sort of hierarchical model as well, where we first predict at the 4-digit, and then for all things at the 4-digit, we feed them for a particular model that's only trained on that like industry's data, and then it would get more and more specific as we went down the hierarchy. So that was like the next phase in the project, but I was not there to see it around, and I think it would have been more successful than what our sort of initial approach was. Yeah.
How comfortable were the census folks with using something like a Hugging Face model and Google reviews to create something as formal as like an economic like variable like that? Like
yeah.
It surprises me like that organization has kind of like a very like buttoned up.
It has a buttoned up reputation for sure. Yeah. I would be shocked if we were ever to put into production. So I was like prototyping everything basically, because they were just like interested to see how it would perform. I haven't heard from anybody I used to work with that this ever like saw the light of day. So I think I would agree with that assessment that they probably don't want to actually put this into production.
Maybe nowadays though.
Maybe nowadays, yeah. I mean, it's come a long way, yeah. Yeah, this was in 2022 that I was working on this, so I can't imagine how much it's like changed since then.
Were you using like a BERT encoder for this?
Say that again, sorry.
Were you using a BERT encoder?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. A couple different sort of variations, but at base it was a BERT encoder, yeah. Cool. So yeah, I obviously talk about that project a lot itself, but one other thing I try to highlight in this is that I was part of like a technical working group when I was at the census. Even though I was only a contractor, they still allowed us to be part of those. I think the sort of thing I try to draw out there is that, as you were saying, the census is like a pretty conservative organization and very bureaucratic. And so trying to like include or like introduce these sort of new best practices as part of my being there, it was like a helpful thing I like to highlight. Cool, okay. So when I left the census, I was very interested in starting to get back into climate work. That was my goal coming out of grad school, but I needed a job, and so I had to take whatever came first. And when that contract ended, I was really trying to find opportunities in the climate space. Unfortunately, for me at the time, like the IRA had passed the summer after I came out of grad school, and so it was a very hot time in the sort of climate movement as a whole. And I was able to find a job at Rewiring America, which is an organization that's pretty tied up with the IRA in general, and was working as a data scientist there. And Rewiring America, to give some like organizational background, is a nonprofit that is focused on advocating for the electrification of the residential building sector in the US. So that means like trying to get people to install heat pumps, to install induction stoves, heat pump water heaters, maybe solar on their roof in the right cases, but basically to take fossil fuels out of the home. And I was part of the research and data science team there. We had like a pretty wide kind of like remit of things that we were asked to work on. And we did a lot of different things, which I'll kind of touch on lightly, a few different things. But I think a big focus in general was just trying to model out impacts of electrification, both for households themselves and for the grid as a whole. And yeah. Just to give a sort of like level set, because I know that home heating is not something that I knew a lot about before I started working at Rewiring. But when I'm talking about heating in particular with, oh God, again.
There we go.
Okay. Yes, so when you look at a home's energy usage, heating and cooling a home is by far the largest energy usage in any sort of household, probably like 60 to 65%, as long as we're not including transportation, if it's just sort of energy uses within the home itself. And so trying to remove fossil fuels from that sort of part of home energy usage is like an important part of the climate movement. This is like one of those sort of sneaky things that consumes way more fossil fuel than you imagine. And so this is a map showing the predominant heating fuels and their geographic distributions across the US. So the largest heating fuel by share in the United States is natural gas. It doesn't take up that much space on here, but that's because it basically is the predominant heating fuel in every city by and large. So the vast majority of the population heats, or not the vast majority, but the majority of the population heats with natural gas, probably something like 60%. Yes?
I thought Chicago was nuclear based.
It is for electricity. I mean, not like fully, but this is for like the home heating in particular. So if you were to go to look at your like furnace in your house, it's like very, very likely that it's using natural gas, and you like pay your heating bill to people's gas because of that. You could have electricity, but most people in Chicago have natural gas. And yeah, you can see the like dark purple there around the Great Lakes. The next after that is electricity. The South in particular, or more temperate climates like the Northwest, will often use electricity for heating. Even with electricity, there's still a sort of goal to get people to install heat pumps because the electric furnaces that they've maybe used in the past are often quite inefficient. Whereas heat pumps are much, much more efficient than that. And so still a sort of play to try and get people to reduce energy usage, even though they're not directly using fossil fuels in heating their homes. Next after that is probably delivered fuels, which is that dark pink up in the Northeast. Very, very common in New England and not super common outside of it. This one is basically like a refined oil product, horribly polluting. Like we want to get rid of this as fast as we can. Also horribly expensive. So like most households are also wanting to make this change because it's really, 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 really expensive. And then after that is we can see some, oh, it's actually wood here. Oh, it's a like light blue color is propane, which is like the final one, which is similar to heating fuels. But it's like a fuel that's delivered to the house in like these huge canisters, also really, really expensive, but pretty common in like colder and rural climates in the north. Yeah, but for all of these different types, like the hope is that people install heat pumps either to remove the burning of the fossil fuels in their home, or as I was saying, even if they're already using electricity, to use it more efficiently in the process of heating their homes. And one of my early projects that I worked on when I was at Rewiring was figuring out how many heat pumps we needed to install per year in order to meet this goal of like net zero by 2050, which I think was a Biden administration goal. I'm not actually positive where that goal came from. But the idea that like we didn't want to be burning any more fossil fuels in the US by 2050, what would the actual sort of change in installed appliances need to look like in the US in order to meet that goal? And so we were using like an S-curve here, which is a sort of typical type of model that people will use for technology adoption. And we were basically just fitting it from where we were at in our current sort of heat pump adoption numbers until we needed to be at 0 in 2050. And what would that number, like, what would that change look like over time? And how many would we need to install per year? And we were then basically comparing that against projected numbers. So we had heat pump sales data from the industry just to know like how many heat pumps were currently being sold. And this would give us a sort of like goal for each year to be like how many should be sold above baseline for us to be showing that we're meeting this kind of goal. I have not looked at this data in a long time. I would be shocked if we were on the S-curve, probably much closer on to that linear curve. But yeah. Cool. This was one that I worked on much more recently. This is so small, sorry. But something that's become of big interest in the energy space as a whole over the past year and a half, 2 years, is just how the grid is going to meet the growing demand from data centers. Part of that is we build more energy capacity, we build more supply. That's a huge part of it. But Rewiring also wanted to make the case that part of that demand could also be met by reducing demand from the residential sector. And so this was analysis we put together to try and look at forecasted load growth in each of the different states based off of the number of data centers that have been permitted so far. So that's the sort of like larger circle in each of these different graphs. And then we have in orange how much of that could be met if everybody in the state were to install solar and batteries in their house. And then the other colors are sort of dependent on the state, but then also how much demand could be covered by the fact that somebody installed a heat pump or a heat pump water heater or other things like that. But basically just looking at the effects on capacity by making some of these changes at the household level instead. Cool. Yeah, and one thing I also worked on there, which I didn't have a chance to throw on a slide, but we also did a lot of work, I was saying, to model the impacts of the impacts of installing a heat pump on an individual home. And I did have a chance to work on a deep learning model there that like did that. And so I'm happy to talk about that further, but I just forgot to throw it in a slide. So if you have questions, I'm happy to get into those. Yeah.
I have a question about the heat pump, like
Yeah.
S-curve.
Yeah.
What is the main bottleneck for achieving that S-curve? Is it just adoption?
Yeah, so I would say like, I mean, it is adoption, but I would say like the barriers to adoption are typically like heat pumps are not super well known in the States. That's starting to change. Like more and more people are aware of them, but they've been much more common in Europe and East Asia for a long time, but are only starting to be more widely adopted in the States. And then the other is like cost considerations, I would say, on like two fronts. One is that heat pumps are typically a bit more expensive than natural gas sort of like for like replacements. So if you were just to go replace your gas furnace right now, a heat pump probably will cost you like a couple $1,000s more to make the install. And then depending on what state you live in and electricity prices and natural gas prices there and the like difference between those two, it can also be more expensive over time to run a heat pump than it is to run a natural gas furnace. So you could see an increase in your bills after installing a heat pump. That's not the predominant sort of story. Like most places in the US, you would save money if you were to install a heat pump, but there are some places that are very cold and where gas is very cheap, where it would be more expensive to operate a heat pump.
So your work with Rewiring America, was that more focused on just like getting an like analytical picture, or was it also policy related and trying to see, okay, where are some areas that we could actually help to increase adoption?
Yeah, so my team's focus was analytical, but we did have a really big policy arm, and that was like one of the biggest like consumers of the analyses that we were producing. So we had some federal folks, and we also had a really big team working with state governments. And so the state teams especially would come to us quite often and be like, oh, this like national thing that you just showed is really interesting, but like I need to go talk to a state assembly person in Oregon this week, and like I think that they're interested, so can we like run more specific numbers for the state of Oregon, and like can you give me more detail than is just included in a graph like this? And we also did a lot of these analyses at the county level. So like if we were talking to a state rep or something like that, somebody working in the governor's office, we could show how like those effects would be different in different parts of the state as well. Because as I was showing with this sort of graph before, like in most states, there's an urban concentration of natural gas, and then rural places heat with a different fuel. It kind of depends on the state what that fuel is. And so there would be different effects in different parts of the states, and that's like something the policy teams would be interested in learning about. But yeah, I would say of the jobs I've worked so far, the work at Rewiring was much less sort of like heavy data science and much more just sort of like a broad kind of data analysis track than had been the case in some previous roles. But work often felt impactful because we did have really good policy access. Like our policy team worked on some really great legislation over the time that I was there. And so I was really excited about being in a place that was like so hands-on and where it felt like you had real immediate wins for the analyses you were producing. Cool. Yeah, so I guess actually to that point, like I have a lot of different things that I can draw on from Rewiring to put into my resume, but one that I make sure I always include is this project to create some public dashboards about like how much households would save if they were to install a heat pump at their house. And it was not like the most technically interesting thing I worked on, but I always include it because I think it shows that I was like able to formulate something that could translate out to wider audiences and be useful in their work. Because like ultimately that was the reason I was at Rewiring, and I think why that data was important. So being able to sort of communicate that outwards was one of the more important things I worked on there. And then also, as I was sort of talking about, like this grid level sort of frame of analysis has become increasingly in demand across the energy industry in the past couple of years. And so being able to show that I'm familiar with like being able to model at a grid level, I think is also a really important thing that I try and show. Yeah, and so last point on here is Invenergy, my current job. I'm actually very new here. I changed jobs since they asked me to come and do this career talk, so I don't really have that much to talk about here, but I work here. Happy to talk about what I do know so far. But yeah, Invenergy is an independent power producer. They use a mixture of technologies. Most of them are renewable. The predominant one is wind, and I'm part of like a central sort of data science and AI team there, which is responsible for modeling and AI adoption and things like that. So yeah, happy to talk about that further as well. But that's it. Happy to spend some time on questions now, though.
In terms of scaling the model which you work for as a research assistant, so what was your most like challenging thing to do in that term?
It's a good question. I think it was a lot of the technical stuff was actually not super difficult, you know, like I think it was where my value was added, but I think where we started to hit issues was that all of the the model that we had created, we'd only really been applying in one particular place. That was kind of like what I was talking about when I joined the project. There was like one particular place that people were focusing on. And as we started to expand, we started to see like weird data coming out of the model just on different types of places that it hadn't seen before. So I'm pretty sure the like original location was in Scotland, and like the color of the ocean is much darker in Scotland than it is in many other parts of the world where the water is like lighter. And so that started like throwing our model off a little bit. So it was much more like the issues we had were like trying to figure out ways at scale to be able to like test the outputs, because it was hard to go and visually inspect like all of these different output prediction like photos, and finding ways to do that at scale so that we could like identify where there were issues. And I'm kind of blanking on what the methods we were that did that now, but that was the most challenging part. Yeah.
What made you want to take a more computational or data science angle to the issue of climate change? Because what you were studying before was pretty like on the qualitative side, I guess,
For sure.
like language and IR. So what made you go from that to something more technical, quantitative, as opposed to going on like the advocacy side?
For sure. Yeah. That's a good question. I think that I had started to be placed in some data roles just kind of like by happenstance, honestly, when I was at that fellowship and just in some of those previous jobs that I kind of skipped over. And I think, so I was already kind of had some exposure to more technical things, but I often felt like really underwater there because I'd never had a formal education in those things, and like was often felt like I was like, it wasn't imposter syndrome because I actually didn't know what I was talking about, you know, like I feel like the imposter syndrome, you do know what you're talking about, you just don't feel like it. But I just like, I was just like bullshitting too much, and I was like, okay, I need to actually like understand these things if I want to continue down a career path in this lane. And so that was like my motivation to like have a more technical focus, but I still wanted to like maintain that policy sort of connection. And I think that's why I chose CAP as opposed to a pure sort of data science or something like that.
Did you get placed on the data teams not because of prior experience or expressed interest, but that's just because the organizations like needed, or how did you?
Yeah, especially at the place in Myanmar, because I mean I had like the lightest bit of experience in some data modeling from undergrad, and like anything on my resume that indicated that, they were like pulling me into those sorts of projects. Yeah.
Do you feel like the CAP program helped you?
Oh, tremendously, like inflection point in like my career for sure. I learned a ton at CAP and like totally changed the trajectory of my career. Yeah.
Do you think you'll go back into the policy realm at all, or do you think this is like where you want to be?
I enjoy this job. I don't know how long this job is. I mean, like not this job is like where I'm currently working, but being a data scientist, like I enjoy being a data scientist quite a lot. I don't know how many data scientists are going to be employed in like the next 15 years. So I think it's like a balance between trying to find like maybe more policy focused areas or things like that in the future, but just trying to like stay relevant in a like as AI is like increasingly a part of my work, and just like staying abreast of that. Yeah.
So part of that, I think that it's like, as you mentioned, your role on Rewire America, like that soft skills between being the bridge between like technical and policy.
Yeah.
How do you, because I struggle a lot with this, how do you break that type of experience like into a resume, for example? Because I can see you can do it in an interview. Yeah. But before going to that part, like, what's your approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will like basically any place I worked, I will always try and have some bullet point along the lines of this like creating public dashboards, where like I'm trying to flag to someone in a point like that like I as a data scientist understand that making a dashboard is not particularly difficult from a technical perspective, but I will say like made dashboard, and that's like basically the extent of the technical part, and then the rest of the bullet point is like it had this impact on these sorts of users. So it's like in this particular use case, it's talking about putting it in front of advocates who were able to apply for funding using the data and like increase their grant funding by XYZ amount. So that's how I like frame it here. But in other use cases, like I think that's the sort of thing where it's like just showing how the data was able to like make a leap out from just your realm into like a more impactful sort of thing for other people you're working with in the business, for policymakers, for advocates, whoever it is. And that like you don't just have this like technical focus only, that you can see the like bigger picture and how that data is useful in other places.
Can you share why you wanted to go from Rewiring America to Invenergy?
It's been a tough time in the, like anybody who's received federal funding over the past couple of years. And so I was looking for somewhere more stable, yeah. Oh yeah, you did.
In line to my question, would you like take us through the work environment, like working for a nonprofit and for a private company, the kind of like the job expectations you went into, and how is that different from working for a company like Invenergy?
Yeah, for sure. It is very different. Like, I think most sort of the biggest way that manifests is just the size of the organizations. Like, at its biggest, Rewiring was about 100 people. And so there were like 4 or 5 of us who were like more data proficient people. And so we were just asked to wear like a lot of different hats. We were asked to work with lots of different teams, work on lots of different types of like modeling problems, some of them like very basic, some of them very advanced. And at Invenergy, it's just a much, much larger organization, so people are much more specialized. So I don't get asked like those sort of small requests like nearly as often, because I have this sort of like data science, AI expertise. I'm working on things that are like more advanced much more often and like sort of solely focused on those and not doing all of that context switching as often as I was when I was working at Rewiring. Yeah.
So you've kind of gotten your start at 3 different places, at Census, at Invenergy, and then at Rewiring, on technical teams. Can you speak to like your approach to like onboarding onto a technical team?
Yeah.
Sort of like drinking from the fire hose, like trying to find the documentation. Like, do you have an approach that you've kind of figured out after 3?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that I have been undergoing recently since I joined Invenergy not too long ago. It is hard, like, because one of the things, I feel like a lot of value you can add as a data scientist or just somebody who's like more technical in general is like just a familiarity with the code base and knowing quickly how to go access things, how to make like these small tweaks that are going to make big downstream changes. One thing that I have found really effective to get to know a code base quickly is to be like really annoying when first starting to work and asking to review every single PR that somebody puts in, which people are actually usually pretty grateful for because people don't like reviewing PRs that much. They just much prefer to code and don't want to be reviewing. And so I just asked to review everything at the start, and then I like pepper it with questions, like so many questions, like even on things that were not necessarily changed in that PR, I'll be asking questions so that I can just build familiarity with the code base. And it also just gives me like an indication of which part of the code base is most active, because usually there's going to be like a lot of not dead code, but like, you know, code that's not used particularly often that's sitting around, and like I don't want to use too much time really diving deep on those things. I'll just dive deep on the parts of the code base that are changing the most frequently at least, and then we'll build the rest of the familiarity over time. But it's like, even working across a couple of organizations, it's still not something I feel like I've perfected. It's a hard thing.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I feel like of course I need to ask about AI.
Yeah.
Right now at Invenergy, I know that you've been for a long time there, but yeah, how is it used? Like, how are they trying to implement it into your workflows? And do you see like any big difference on, you know, application processes or your daily life as a data scientist with, you know, before and after like the AI?
Yeah. Invenergy, I think like a lot of places is very like curious about AI, and I think figuring out like the best places to implement it. I think that there's a lot of interest across Invenergy at least, but I think probably many organizations about using AI to like unlock data that's like sort of sitting dormant in the organization, because there is a lot of data out there at a company the size of Invenergy's that's just going to be like sitting in random Excel files, random Word documents, random PDFs and things like that, that is not like sort of harnessed into a database that can be used for more advanced modeling at all. And so like a big thing that the team has been doing recently is like setting up pipelines to sort of automatically ingest those data formats that have historically been like a little harder to get data out of, and then like clean them in a way that's like usable for other types of modeling. But like, that's just sort of scratching the surface. There's like, and I'm just saying that because I've been working on that recently. Like, there are lots of things that I think the organization is interested in using it for. For me personally, how it's like changed my sort of day-to-day as a data scientist, I was very stubborn for a long time and kind of refused to use it because I was annoyed that it existed, but have like come around, and there are certain things that I turn to for AI immediately now. Like, I never debug manually anymore. Like, if I hit an error, like I just immediately dump it, and it's almost always solved like quite quickly. I like never write a doc string anymore. Like all those sorts of like more annoying parts of code that like are very important. Like I hate reviewing code that doesn't have doc strings, but those things take up time. And if you can just immediately kind of give it off to AI, it makes things much faster. I actually like, because of licensing stuff at Invenergy, I actually haven't used Claude Code yet. So I'm not like at the forefront of like everything. But I'm curious to try it out. The one thing I will not do though is like, I will never just let AI just fully go for it and like fully write a program for me, because I find that the code it writes is really unnecessarily verbose and like often overspecified to the particular problem at hand. And so it's not like generalized in a way that is like useful for handling multiple use cases in the future. It's often just sort of good at like handling the case that's in front of it. I will do it for like idea generation sometimes, where I'll tell it to go do that, and then it'll like generate probably like 3 times as much code as is needed, but like there'll be some package that it imports that I've never used before, and then I'll go like investigate that package and be like, oh, okay, this is actually a very helpful sort of thing to use here, but I like take 2 lines of code probably from the actual code that the AI wrote for me. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about your experience at Epic. So you said that it was valuable and like to frame your position there as sort of being the only computer scientist as part of a larger interdisciplinary team. Did you struggle at all then when you hit like just blocks in your work? Like, did you have a hard time finding people or resources that you could turn to? I don't know if your team or like your mentor experienced the coding part, but I imagine you bring a lot of value added, but when you ran into like roadblocks, what were some resources that you turned to? I'll actually be at Epic this
Oh, okay,
summer,
great,
and
cool.
probably also not working with a super technical team.
Yeah.
So.
I did find it hard when I would like hit issues like that. I think that like other people in CAP were one place that I would always turn. I was in a class that also used the research computing cluster at the time. And so I would go to my professor.
Riley knows.
Yeah.
I was at Epic this summer and used the RCC.
Okay,
design.
yeah.
It was so helpful.
Yeah, and so I would go to that professor and ask questions that were not about class, but just about using the RCC sometimes. So that was a helpful thing. And even though the people I was working with are not computer scientists by training, they were all very technical and all very like numeric, like they're economists and oceanographers. And so like they understand data and were often good at like helping me to like take a step back and be like, how can I like reframe this problem in a different way? And I've been kind of like butting my head against a wall, and like what's a different view I could take that like might like elucidate the problem a little bit better than the approach I've been taking so far. And I found that part was like really helpful. Yeah.
Brainstorming on that.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.